Greetings, loyal listeners, and any new members we may have to our little party here this time around. New members are always encouraged. Thank you for joining us. My name is Brian Frydenborg. I am an international affairs, development, and public policy professional, as well as a freelance writer, journalist, and historian. And this is my second episode for the year 2015. I can't get used to saying that just yet, but it is 2015 now, and today is January 10th. And it's the second episode, 2015, of my podcast show, Calling It Like It Is. And today's topic is obviously going to be controversial, but we're going to talk about Islam in the wake of the Charlie Hebdo attacks. And I'll be both attacking and defending Islam here, as you will see. Now, it's been a bad month for Islam. Unfortunately, our year 2014 ended and the year 2015 opened with some pretty bad stuff involving that religion. And what are we talking about here? Well, we're talking about the horrific Taliban attack against hundreds of school children in Peshawar, Pakistan. We're talking about fanatical Muslim wannabe cleric who took hostages in a cafe in Australia and killed some of them. We're talking about Boko Haram just this week, wiping out a whole village, killing many dozens, if not hundreds, possibly 2,000 people in a very short span of time in Nigeria, this Islamic extremist group that is trying to copy ISIS, the Islamic State, and try to set up their own Islamic State. This town didn't want to be a part of it, and the whole town was burned down, and there's nobody living there now. They've all fled or been murdered. And we're still getting sketchy details with wide-ranging estimates, but as many as 2,000 people were massacred. Maybe as few as several dozen, but that's still awful. So that's going on. In addition, in Saudi Arabia, we have a young man who was arrested in 2012 for starting up a blog called Free Saudi Liberals, who criticized the religious establishment in Saudi Arabia. And without going into details right now, let's just say pretty much everything about the religious establishment in Saudi Arabia can and should be criticized. It's awful. This young boy, whose own father has denounced him, by the way, which says a lot about Saudi society, sentenced to 1,000 lashes, 10 years in prison, and a large fine. And his sentence just started to be carried out as far as the lashing part. He got 50 beatings with a cane. It's not supposed to be all at once, because that would kill him, and it wasn't a death sentence, but that's obviously barbaric. This poor young guy, he just is a free thinker. The Saudi government, by the way, has also, a few months ago, declared atheists to be terrorists. Not sure how that works, but anyway. So there's the Saudi government doing its part to make Islam look bad. And then we had this horrid situation in Paris over this past week, where Charlie Hebdo, which is a French satirical cartoonist newspaper that picks on everybody and everything, leaves nothing sacred, and can be quite offensive. But that's free speech. That's how it works. That doesn't mean you don't expect criticism, but you certainly don't expect to be violently attacked or murdered. Well, that's what happens. Some Islamic extremists didn't like the way Islam was portrayed, the Prophet Muhammad and others in their cartoons, and they stormed the office. They killed several people there, including 2 police officers who tried to help. And there's a hashtag all around the world, especially among journalists, and I consider myself at least something of a journalist and a free thinker. Je suis Charlie. I am Charlie, meaning Charlie Hebdo, the paper, meaning we identify with you. That doesn't mean that most people like the message or the cartoons and don't find them offensive. I, for one, find them distasteful and very poor taste. Definitely offensive. I don't like the cartoons about Muhammad and other Islamic stuff I've seen. That's not to say that they don't have some good and funny stuff, but still, that's political satire. It's meant to be offensive to somebody. It's not. You're picking on someone's beliefs and someone's politics or personal whatever. That's free speech in a critical society. Okay. So je suis Charlie, and I identify with the attack on free speech and feel it. I don't have to like their paper or their publication. I don't like Rush Limbaugh or Sean Hannity. If someone killed them, I'd be outraged at that. Killed them just because of their viewpoints, which I find abhorrent. But they have every right to make those statements about what they believe publicly, and that's a free society. That's France, that's America, that's the West. Some other places too, like Japan. But that is how you organize a free society. You have freedom of speech. The same freedoms that allow a Muslim to worship in France are the same freedoms that allow Charlie Hebdo to criticize those beliefs publicly. If you don't like it, don't buy the paper, don't read it, form a blog, complain, write a letter to the editor, start a protest outside the office, whatever you want. Do not engage in violence. That is the line that you cannot cross in our societies in the West. So, aside from this Je suis Charlie hashtag, which blew up on Twitter, maybe one of the biggest hashtags ever, we've also got Je suis Ahmed. Why? Because there was a police officer named Ahmed Merabeh who was killed. He came to try and help out with the situation unfolding in the office of Charlie Hebdo. He was a Muslim. He begged for his life and was crying at the end. It didn't stop these sick Islamic extremist terrorist murderers from killing him. This Muslim police officer, this is something that everybody needs to be aware of, died defending the right in a free society in which he lived, in which he was a citizen, defending the right of this Charlie Hebdo to viciously and tastelessly mock his religion. That is what the West and freedom of speech and free societies are all about. Okay? So, and that's what this was an attack on. This was an attack on freedom of speech, on journalism, on journalists, on being able to print criticism of anything that some people will not like. In this case, Muslims, but we've certainly seen throughout history people saying things that are not popular. You know, Cicero's speech against Mark Antony got him killed. Mark Antony told him, "You mess with me again, I'm going to cut off your tongue that speaks and your hands which write and nail them to the Senate door." And that's what happened to him. Okay? And Cicero was fighting for what had been a free society and no longer was, clearly, at that point. And this is a big deal. All these attacks are awful. And they all feature Muslims prominently. There have been many other attacks in Afghanistan, Iraq. I think Pakistan had some other small levels of violence. But there have been a whole lot of bad, violent terrorist attacks going on. And most of that violence has involved Muslim extremists of one sort or another. And so the question is, what's up with Islam? Is Islam the problem? Should Islam be singled out? Is religion the problem? I'm going to say it's religion. And I'm going to say that even though currently the practice of Islam is more extreme than other religions and that there are more Muslim extremists, there's nothing inherently wrong with Islam in comparison to other religions that should make a single Islam out and say Islam's the problem and not religion. To me, Islam's no better or worse than Christianity, than Judaism, than Hinduism, Buddhism, any of these major faiths that we have today that people practice. You will find today all of these faiths with violent extremists. Maybe not as many proportionally as Islam, but you will still find them. The Lord's Resistance Army in Central Africa, Christian terrorist organization, has been killing thousands of people for years, displacing millions. Extremist Jewish settlers in the West Bank are constantly committing violent acts, sometimes murder, against Arab Palestinians. We certainly know that Jews in Israel are also suffering from their fair share is the wrong term, but from certainly suffering from terrorism as well. That doesn't excuse killing Arab civilians. The Israeli occupation doesn't excuse Hamas and other terrorist groups killing Israeli civilians, okay? So Buddhist monks are killing Muslims, wiping out communities and massacring them in Burma, in India. There's Hindu violence against Muslims and Muslim violence against Hindus. And go on and on and on, okay? But all around the world there's religious violence, although right now it's important to be honest, and Islam does have a problem right now, today, relative to other faiths. That hasn't always been the case. Well, we're going to go into all of this. But I want to begin by quoting one of my heroes, one of the greatest, if not the greatest, recent nonfiction writers in the English language, and that's Christopher Hitchens. And he died of cancer a few years ago, over 3 years ago now, December 2011. But his articles are so good sometimes that when something happens relevant to one of his pieces, a lot of great major publications will just reprint what he had to say about this, that, or the other thing. And in this case, one of his articles was reprinted in a number of major publications and online forums and sites just a few days ago. And I'm going to read that for you. It's not that long. But before we do that, I'm going to read something else. A quote that Christopher Hitchens used in the introduction to his book, God is Not Great, How Religion Poisons Everything, which I don't completely agree with, but I certainly agree with a lot of what he has to say in that book. And he opens with 3 quotes, and this is one of them. And do you think that unto such as you, a maggot-minded, starved, fanatic crew, God gave a secret and denied it me? Well, well, what matters it? Believe that too. The Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, Richard Le Gallienne translation. Now this is important. This is a Muslim writing hundreds of years ago, at a time when Islam was very cosmopolitan, scientific, tolerant. And this is a Muslim writing about fanaticism and religious bigotry, where a bunch of crazy people run around and literally think that they know the mind of God, that you don't, and they're going to tell you what you have to do. And if you don't listen, they're going to force you or kill you. I mean, he says, well, well, what matters that? If you want to believe that, you go on being crazy, but anybody, I don't care what religion or who you are or what faith you are, anyone that ever claims to know the mind of the divine, you can immediately stop taking them seriously. And you do not have to respect anything that comes out of their mouth in relation to that subject. Nobody has an edge on the mind of the divine. Nobody can. How would God possibly tell one person but not somebody else? I mean, that's silliness. If there even is a God. And I'm not an atheist, but I really don't see God as talking to people and interfering with this and that and causing a flood here and raising a guy from the dead there. I don't buy that type of stuff. I think whatever God is, or they, or it, he, she, whatever are, is beyond our comprehension, as I may have mentioned in an earlier podcast. So for me, I respect all religions equally as being equally wrong, but there's certainly a lot of good in all religions. But there's also a lot of bad, and we're going to be getting into that. But anyway, Hitchens says this so much more eloquently than I can, so I'm just going to read this article, which came out early in 2006, so that's 8 years ago, but it still rings quite true today. And this was in response to violence from some Muslim extremists. That was in response to a Danish newspaper printing cartoons that made fun of Islam. So here is the article. Cartoon Debate: The Case for Mocking Religion by Christopher Hitchens. And Christopher Hitchens was raised as a Brit. I am certainly not going to try to attempt his accent. That would be asinine, but still. This is me reading Hitchens. As well as being a small masterpiece of inarticulacy and self-abnegation, the statement from the State Department about this week's international Muslim pogrom against the free press was also accidentally accurate. Quote, anti-Muslim images are as unacceptable as anti-Semitic images, as anti-Christian images, or any other religious belief. Thus, the hapless Sean McCormick, reading painfully slowly from what was reported as a prepared government statement. How appalling for the country of the First Amendment to be represented by such an administration. What does he mean, unacceptable? That it should be forbidden? And how abysmal that a spokesman cannot distinguish between criticism of a belief system and slander against a people. However, the illiterate McCormick is right in unintentionally comparing racist libels to religious faith. Many people have pointed out that the Arab and Muslim press is replete with anti-Jewish caricature, often of the most lurid and hateful kind. In one way, the comparison is hopelessly inexact. These foul items mostly appear in countries where the state decides what is published or broadcast. However, when Muslims republish the protocols of the Elders of Zion or perpetuate the story of Jewish blood sacrifice at Passover, they are recycling the fantasies of the Russian Orthodox Christian secret police, in the first instance, and of centuries of Roman Catholic and Lutheran propaganda in the second. And when an Israeli politician refers to Palestinians as snakes, or pigs, or monkeys, it is near to a certainty that he will be a rabbi, most usually Rabbi Ovadia Yosef, the leader of the disgraceful Shas party, and will cite Talmudic authority for his racism. For most of human history, religion and bigotry have been two sides of the same coin, and it still shows. Therefore, there is a strong case for saying that the Danish newspaper Jyllands-Posten and those who have reprinted its efforts out of solidarity are affirming the right to criticize not merely Islam, but religion in general. And the Bush administration has no business at all expressing an opinion on that. If it is to say anything, it is constitutionally obliged to uphold the right and no more. You can be sure that the relevant European newspapers have also printed their share of cartoons making fun of nuns and popes and messianic Israeli settlers, and taunting child-raping priests. There was a time when this would not have been possible, but those taboos have been broken. Which is what taboos are for. Islam makes very large claims for itself. In its art, there is a prejudice against representing the human form at all. The prohibition on picturing the Prophet, who is only another male mammal, is apparently absolute. So is the prohibition on pork or alcohol, or, in some Muslim societies, music or dancing. Very well then, let the good Muslim abstain rigorously from all these. But if he claims the right to make me abstain as well, he offers the clearest possible warning and proof of an aggressive intent. The current uneasy coexistence is only an interlude, he seems to say. For the moment, all I can do is claim to possess absolute truth and demand absolute immunity from criticism. But in the future, you will do what I say, and you will do it on pain of death. I refuse to be spoken to in that tone of voice, which, as it happens, I chance to find offensive. By the way, hasn't the word offensive really become offensive lately? The innate human revulsion against desecration is much older than any monotheism. Its most powerful expression is in the Antigone of Sophocles. It belongs to civilization. I am not asking for the right to slaughter a pig in a synagogue or mosque, or to relieve myself on a quote holy end quote book. But I will not be told that I can't eat pork, and I will not respect those who burn books on a regular basis. I, too, have strong convictions and beliefs, and value the Enlightenment above any priesthood or any sacred fetish object. It is revolting to me to breathe the same air as wafts from the exhalations of the madrasas, or the reeking fumes of suicide murderers, or the sermons of Billy Graham and Joseph Ratzinger. But these same principles of mine also prevent me from wreaking random violence on the nearest church, or kidnapping a Muslim at random and holding him hostage, or violating diplomatic immunity by attacking the embassy or the envoys of even the most despotic Islamic state, or making a moronic spectacle of myself, threatening blood and fire to faraway individuals who may have hurt my feelings. The babyish, rumor-fueled tantrums that erupt all the time, especially in the Islamic world, show yet again that faith belongs to the spoiled and selfish childhood of our species. As it happens, the cartoons themselves are not very brilliant, or very mordant either. But if Muslims do not want their alleged prophet identified with barbaric acts or adolescent fantasies, they should say publicly that random murder for virgins is not in their religion. And here, one runs up against a curious reluctance. In fact, Sunni Muslim leaders can't even seem to condemn the blowing up of Shiite mosques and funeral processions, which even I would describe as sacrilege. Of course, there are many millions of Muslims who do worry about this. And another reason for condemning the idiots at Foggy Bottom is their assumption, dangerous in many ways, that the first lynch mob on the scene is actually the genuine voice of the people. There's an insult to Islam, if you like. The question of offensiveness is easy to decide. First, suppose that we all agree to comport ourselves in order to avoid offending the believers. How could we ever be sure that we had taken enough precautions? On Saturday, I appeared on CNN, which was so terrified of reprisal that it pixelated the very cartoons that its viewers needed to see. And this ignoble fear in Atlanta, Georgia, arose because of an illustration in a small Scandinavian newspaper of which nobody had ever heard before. It is not clear, then, that those who are determined to be offended will discover a provocation somewhere? We cannot possibly adjust enough to please the fanatics, and it is degrading to make the attempt. Second, and important enough to be insisted upon, can the discussion be carried on without the threat of violence, or the automatic resort to it? When Salman Rushdie published the Satanic Verses in 1988, he did so in the hope of forwarding a discussion that was already opening in the Muslim world between extreme Quranic literalists and those who hoped that the text could be interpreted. We know what his own reward was, and we sometimes forget that the fatwa was directed not just against him, but against all those involved in its publication, which led to the murder of the book's Japanese translator and the near deaths of another translator and one publisher. I went on Crossfire at one point to debate some spokesman for outraged faith, and said that we on our side would happily debate the propriety of using Holy Writ for literary and artistic purposes, but that we would not exchange a word until the person on the other side of the podium had put away his gun. The menacing Muslim big mouth on the other side refused to forswear state-sponsored suborning of assassination, and was of course backed up by the Catholic bigot Pat Buchanan. The same point holds for international relations. There can be no negotiation under duress or under the threat of blackmail and assassination. And civil society means that free expression trumps the emotions of anyone to whom free expression might be inconvenient. It is depressing to have to restate these obvious precepts, and it is positively outrageous that the administration should have discarded them at the very first sign of a fight. So anyway, that is Christopher Hitchens writing about 8 years ago about a situation very similar to the one we have been reading about this week. And Salman Rushdie, for those of you who don't know, wrote the Satanic Verses, which was a novel very critical of Islam, and he's Persian, Iranian, and the Iranian Ayatollahs thought it was a good idea in response to him writing this book to issue a fatwa calling for his murder. So that was what that was in reference to. And Foggy Bottom, for those of you who don't know, refers to the State Department, basically, because that's the location of the State Department. But anyway, that's Christopher Hitchens. Now, he says a lot of what I'd like to say as well as anyone can say it. So that speaks for itself. But now we need to move on to something very telling, I think, of these really, really awful extremist groups. The head of Hezbollah. And for those of you who don't know, Hezbollah is a terrorist organization in Lebanon. It was formed in response to the Israeli invasion and occupation. They carried out a lot of suicide bombers and are often credited with being the main reason that Israel decided to finally leave Lebanon after almost 20 years of military occupation and military operations there. Hezbollah really started off as a militia fighting on behalf of Shiite Muslims in Lebanon. And Shiite Muslims are basically the bottom rung of the ladder under the Sunnis and the more powerful Christians, and they were getting oppressed by everybody. And someone had to stick up for them, and into that vacuum came Hezbollah. The Israelis sure weren't sticking up for them, neither were the Sunnis or the Christians. So that became part of the whole ugly situation of the Lebanese civil war and all that. But anyway, they're Shia, and Bashar Assad's regime in Syria is a Shia regime that controls mostly Sunnis. So Hezbollah naturally is allies with them because Sunnis have been oppressing Shiites in general in the region for a very long time. But then again, in Syria, you have an exception where it's a Alawite, which is a sect of Shia Islam, an Alawite leader oppressing a lot of Sunnis. And they try to look out for each other. That's why also Iran, which is Shia, even though they're ethnically Persian and not Arab like Hezbollah or Assad, they all share the Shia religion, so they support each other. So Hezbollah has been fighting in Syria on behalf of the Assad regime. I'm not happy with that. But overall, as far as its situation with Israel, it's been pretty peaceful over the last 10 years. It's part of the Lebanese government. Things haven't really been that bad as far as violence in Lebanon, but they're starting to get worse now. But that's not really because of Hezbollah, it's because of the Syrian civil war overall. But anyway, the head of Hezbollah. This is a terrorist resistance movement, certainly not like ISIS and Al Qaeda, far less extreme. He just gave a talk, a big speech saying these types of attacks happened in Paris, and it wasn't just Charlie Hebdo, it was also a kosher deli, and that is just pure anti-Semitism. When you're just attacking Jews because they're Jews, even if you don't like Israel and its government policies, it's one thing, and I'm not condoning this violence, but if it's something about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict where it's the Israelis and the Palestinians fighting each other, that's one thing, and I don't like that. But you can't kill Jews in Paris, French citizens, and say, oh, it's because of... No, that's just anti-Semitism in its purest form. You're just killing Jews because they're Jews. That is anti-Semitism, period. That's not, some Palestinian defending his home against the IDF or revenge tit-for-tat attacks back and forth between Israeli and Palestinians and Israeli civilians and Palestinian civilians. That is just anti-Semitism. So these types of attacks, you had the head of Hezbollah saying, this is too far, it's awful. He said Islamic extremists of this caliber, obviously they wouldn't consider themselves extremists, and they're certainly far more moderate than those types of people. But he's saying these types of Islamic extremists, ISIS, and the people who carried out the Paris attack, they're a greater threat and they're more offensive to Islam than these cartoons, which is a very sensible thing to say, and I applaud the head of Hezbollah for saying that. And that brings me to a point where I want to say it's extremely important to distinguish between these different groups. And what you're seeing is these horrible, horrible groups really making some of the other violent extremist Muslim groups realize they need to moderate their behavior. They don't want to be seen to be like these guys. And some of that has been happening already. I would put Hamas and Hezbollah, resistance movements, which do commit horrible acts of terrorism and should be condemned for those acts. But they're pretty localized. Hezbollah is worried about Lebanon for the most part, and Hamas is worried about Palestinians for the most part. And they have their enemy Israel, or in the case of Lebanon right now, they're mainly concerned with asserting the rights of the Shia community within Lebanon. And that's why they're mostly peaceful politicians at this point. I mean, yeah, they have a big militia in waiting, building up weapons. That's troublesome. And they're fighting in Syria. But still, you have Hamas and Hezbollah, which are essentially resistance movements that use terrorism, but spend most of their time not committing terrorist acts, but governing and trying to run Lebanon or Gaza. Okay, that's one thing. Then you have the Taliban, which is another level. You increase the level. Far, far, far more brutal, right? Hezbollah and Hamas don't force women to dress in all black and veils, and they're not particularly restrictive on what people can do. They're certainly not like the Saudi thought police even. But then the Taliban, super extreme. But they're mainly focused on Afghanistan, Pakistan area. They're not this let's spread all over the world messianic kind of thing. Al-Qaeda, and actually within that Taliban category, let's also include Al-Shabaab, which is also very brutal, although it's been parts of it back and forth in terms of how moderate they've become and act. But Al-Shabaab is pretty bad, and we saw that attack in Kenya, which had a lot to do with the role the Kenyan army was playing in Somalia. Other than that, Al-Shabaab's not trying to run off to France or Spain or Russia and do stuff, okay? So, the lowest tier of Islamic extremists, you got groups like Hamas, Hezbollah. Then you've got the Taliban and Al-Shabaab, which are very extreme, but not really internationalizing that much. And then the next level is a group like Al-Qaeda, which is very brutal and will strike pretty much anywhere, as we've seen. U.S., New York, Washington, we've seen London, Madrid, all over Iraq and uh, Syria, and so it's been awful, right? But then the next level beyond that is ISIS and Boko Haram. And I mentioned Boko Haram with that big attack in Nigeria. These guys are very brutal. They engage in mass killing, and they're trying to establish an Islamic State. Much more brutal than even, from what I understand, than even what Al-Shabaab's trying to do in Somalia at this point. It may have been different before. But no, I mean, they just are the most extreme. And what's interesting is that within militant Islam, you're seeing a split. These crazy, extreme, brutal, violent, mass killing types are alienating the more focused, localized. We're not really just here to kill people. We actually have, we just want our freedom. We want better conditions and quality of life for our people. We don't want to live under occupation. So we do have to make these distinctions. Okay? That's important. And it's my hope that we can take groups like Hamas and Hezbollah and move them into a more peaceful mentality and a less violent mentality, and cause their acts to be less violent, cause them to commit violence less often, and that we can have groups like the Taliban and Al-Shabaab really prevent them from expanding and internationalizing and just keep them localized, because they'll be easier to beat in the long run that way. But the real problem right now is ISIS, is Boko Haram, and people like these guys who are just going to go kill people they disagree with over cartoons, or just kill people because they're Jews. Really, just the worst of the worst. Even though that was just a small thing, and these guys are trained with Al Qaeda. Apparently, so yeah. So let's keep all these distinctions in mind. Not every Islamic militant extremist is like every other one. Not every Muslim is an Islamic militant extremist. In fact, the vast majority are not. So anyway, a lot of these issues came up a few weeks ago, or maybe over a couple months ago, on Bill Maher's show. And I love me some Bill Maher. I love Bill Maher. I don't always agree with him. Sometimes I think he goes a little too far, but usually I think he's actually spot on. He's very bright. If you don't believe me, watch his show. So anyway, many of you may have heard about this, but Bill Maher and Ben Affleck especially really got into it on the show. Ben Affleck was a guest, and they're friends and they get along fine. Ben Affleck's been on the show many times before, and that's what's great about the show, is you really do sometimes get a lively discussion at length, not just a 2-minute segment on CNN. Okay, and the other guests were Nicholas Kristof, who I think is absolutely amazing, one of the best columnists on the New York Times, at the New York Times, I should say. Michael Steele was also on. He's black, but he was the head of the Republican National Committee. Big surprise that didn't work out too well. He's pretty moderate, and black. Um, Probably more so because he was moderate that we got run out of town from that position. So I don't agree with him on a lot of things, but I still like him. And then we had Sam Harris, who's one of the quote unquote new atheists, end quote. That includes Christopher Hitchens, Richard Dawkins, among others. I vastly prefer Hitchens to Harris, even though I agree with a lot of what Harris has to say. I think Hitchens' tone is better, less insulting and condescending, and uh, Harris just. But we'll get into Harris. But anyway, he's a big atheist. He's very critical of religion, and so he's on the show. And in terms of who I agree with here, Michael Steele kind of just jumps in a little bit. So it's really between uh, Christoph, who I would say I agree with completely in this situation, Ben Affleck, who I agree with the next most, then Bill Maher, who I also agree with the next most, but then he's kind of with Harris on this, and I disagree with him the most, even though I also agree with Harris to an extent as well. So I have strong agreement with a lot of these guys, but in this conversation in particular, I disagree with the most with Harris, followed by Bill Maher, followed by Ben Affleck, and then I'm totally on the same page with Christoph. So anyway, they're having this discussion, and I should give you some context here because Bill Maher's thing for quite some time is that he's a big liberal. He is all about treating women well, women's rights, freedom of speech, liberal values, nonviolence, that kind of stuff, okay? And yet, he finds himself relatively alone on the left in terms of how vehement he is of denouncing Islamic extremism. And part of that is because Muslims and Arabs in particular have been pretty heavily oppressed by colonialism, imperialism, the West, all this stuff over history. And so that is a big thing with liberals, is they try to be on the side of the oppressed and try to be less critical of minorities and more understanding and tolerant of them. And that's a good thing in and of itself, but it can be taken too far. And I'm with Bill Maher that I think some of the criticism on the left has been a bit too tepid and timid. And that's also a point that Sam Harris makes. And you know what? I agree. I think so far they're not in dangerous territory. That's fine. It's the way they both talk about Islam, with Harris in particular. And that's the issue that Ben Affleck, especially, but also Christoph, had on this show. But Bill Maher's thing is that he feels like, and he's somewhat accurate, that liberals are a bit too reluctant to really speak out about what's going on with Islam today. And that's this conversation that erupts. So Sam Harris is here, and he's talking, and he starts criticizing Islam, obviously. And Ben Affleck takes exception to that. And he, in fact, says, and this is where he really lost me as well, as Affleck and Christoph, he said, quote, Islam at the moment is the motherlode of bad ideas, end quote. As if somehow there's something special about the Muslim faith, the Islamic religion, in comparison to all other faiths, that's really bad. And that Islam itself has really bad ideas. For me, it's religion and religious fundamentalists. And there might be more of them in Islam, and they who are the extremists, there might be more extreme than extremists in some other faiths right now. But it's just religion in general for me, and I will get into that later. But he says that, and Ben Affleck's just like, whoa. And they're talking about tolerance and intolerance, and how, Christoph pipes in and reminds them that tolerance is also a liberal value. But you can't be tolerant for intolerance, Bill Maher says. And then Nicholas Christoph, this is his response. No, of course not. But the picture you're painting is to some extent true, but it's usually incomplete. It is certainly true that plenty of fanatics and jihadi are Muslim, but the people who are standing up to them, Malala, Muhammad Ali, Dad Khan in Iran, in prison for 9 years for speaking up for Christians. A friend that I had in Pakistan who was shot this year, Rashid Rehman, for defending people accused of apostasy. And so that's Christoph giving examples of Muslims standing up against Muslim extremism, and how the picture that Harris and Marr are painting isn't giving a full, complete picture. And Ben Affleck starts going on, how about the more than 1 billion people who aren't fanatical, who don't punish women, who just want to go to school, have some sandwiches. So that's Ben Affleck. And then this is Sam Harris's response that Bill Maher is agreeing with. And to some degree, Sam Harris is right here. Even though Ben Affleck and Christoph were definitely just right. And Sam Harris says to think of the global Muslim population as a series of concentric circles. The very, very small dot that is the violent terrorist Muslim extremists, okay? Then you have Islamists who believe the same core principles, but they are not willing to act violently on them. They have the same beliefs, but they're not violent in trying to implement them. They want to bring them about democratically. They're not going to kill people in order to bring these, make these beliefs of theirs law, okay? And take the law into their own hands to do so. Okay? That's probably a lot of the people in Saudi Arabia, for example. The state's lashing that kid. They're not going to grab a cane and go do it themselves. If that's permitted, then they're not going to take the violence into their own hand and kill people. And that's a lot of Muslims. Definitely not a majority. Definitely nowhere near a majority, but that's a lot. Then you have a huge portion of Muslims who share some of those extreme beliefs and also don't act on them, and also, but then they don't have some of the other extreme beliefs. And then you have a smaller group out there who are just really moderate, don't hold any extreme beliefs at all. It's a very significant number of Muslims in this last group. But still not as large as the Islamists combined with the people who have some extreme beliefs. That's a huge portion. And then you have a much smaller group who are just really liberal Muslims. And then beyond that, people who are just secular but raised Muslim but don't take it seriously. Now, when you combine it, that's a clear vast majority that are not violent at all. Okay? But then you have a huge portion, in some countries a majority, and other countries not. It really depends where you are, even within the Arab world, okay? And then you've got hundreds of millions of Indians in places like Indonesia, India, that aren't violent at all, but that may support. They're much more moderate, but then some of them, at least a significant number, do support some of these extreme ideas. But what Sam Harris is saying is that you have to think about these large groups of Muslims, large proportion of the Muslim population who are not violent but support extremist ideology either fully or partially. That's a huge portion. And it's something that does need to be dealt with and understood for what it is. And sometimes I hear liberals, and in this case, Ben Affleck, who I think is doing a great job defending Islam against some unfair attacks on this show in this moment. But you'll just get to say, oh, they're just as moderate as anybody else. They all just want to be left alone, and they don't believe in any of that crazy stuff. Well, that's not exactly true. There's been some really good polling by Pew and other groups. Okay, and we even had a Cambridge university study that showed about a third of young Jordanian adults believe honor killing. That's when a girl or a boy in the family behave inappropriate sexually, or they go off and marry someone they're not supposed to, and the family just kills them because they're dishonoring the family. That is not wildly common, but it's certainly not incredibly uncommon either. It happens. It happens in places like India. It happens in the Arab world. It happens, it's not just a Muslim thing either. It's more of a traditional societal thing. And, if you go back in Christian history, that would happen. Okay? But anyway, about a third of young Jordanian adults, and this is in teens, students kind of. This is the older student age. And Jordan, I live in Jordan, full disclosure, I live in the capital city of Amman. Jordan's one of the most moderate Muslim countries, period. And yet still, you're going to find a lot of people, strong minorities, that have these views, that they're cool with honor killings. They're not going to necessarily do it themselves, but the situation is described, and this is a third who either strongly agree or agree that that's okay, that the parents killed the kid in that situation. And there's about 45% of young boys and over 20% of young girls. For every 5 women, that's over 1 out of every 5 they're okay with their parents killing someone for marrying for love, for example. That's a very moderate Muslim, very moderate Arab country. So that is something that liberals, myself included, in that category, I'm a liberal, but that's something that liberals need to acknowledge. Okay? They can't just make excuses for that either and pretend it doesn't exist. Okay? But I think Sam Harris attributes too much weight to some of those categories, some more extreme ones. He sees that some countries have majorities of Muslims that are okay with these beliefs. That another one was stoning, or you're supposed to kill people who abandon the Muslim faith. If they were raised Muslim and then they leave the faith, the Quran says you can punish that by death, and there's specific ways. There's a lot of restrictions on how that can happen and if that can happen, but lots of Muslims all over the world believe that. In some places, like I said, majorities, in others, strong minorities. In other places, very few people believe that. So we do have to remember 1.6 billion people, very diverse geographically and in terms of beliefs. So if you go Muslims in America, you don't find that. You go Muslims in Indonesia, 200-something million people, I think 250 million people, you don't find that. But Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, yeah, you're going to find that. But we can't paint the brush of everybody. We can't brush everybody with the extremist brush. So anyway, that discussion ends up happening. And then, and Fareed Zakaria pointed this out too. He had Harris on shortly after this, and he basically said Harris is right to a degree that Islam does have a problem, but the way he's talking about it is too strong, and it's not nuanced enough, and it doesn't help. And I agree completely with that. But anyway, Sam Harris and Ben Affleck are really going at it, and Nick Kristof jumps in, and he makes this very important point, which I completely agree with. The Great Divide, this is a quote, the Great Divide is not between Islam and the rest. It's rather between the fundamentalists and the moderates in each faith. Boom! Kristof is completely right. I completely agree with him there. That doesn't mean that we can't look at Islam and say right now at this sliver of a moment in history, there are more Islamic extremists, because there are, than other extremists in other religions, proportionally and absolutely. Okay? But we can't blow that out of proportion or blow it or under appreciate that problem. And for me, Affleck a little bit underappreciates it. Kristof seems to get it. Affleck a little bit underappreciates it, but Marr and Sam Harris blow it a little bit out of proportion. Harris, I think, more so than Marr even. And then Michael Steele, the one time he really gets involved, he jumps in to say that, look, the most extreme people often get the most media attention. And there are a lot of Muslims, as Christoph had pointed out, fighting this stuff and speaking out against it. Because you always hear people saying, oh, Muslims never speak up against it. Maybe the moderate Muslim community needs to speak up more, and that those concentric circles that are just outside the murderous extremists, the ones that aren't murdering but do agree or partially agree, all the rest of the Muslims need to shame those people into no longer supporting those types of beliefs. And all of them together need to speak out strongly against the violence, because that's not happening strongly enough. I gotta tell you, I'm here in Amman, in Jordan, and there's awful Israeli military activity in Gaza that, for me, just was way over the top of what needed to be done in response to the rocket fire that only killed a few dozen Israelis. Actually, it only killed a couple. Most of the people that died on the Israeli side were soldiers when they were going into Gaza. But anyway, then over 2,000 people were killed by the Israeli military's assault into Gaza. And for something that really just was not much of a threat, honestly. If you can read all about this in my Israel Hamas Gaza Poker Game of Death article and or ebook on my website. You should be able to find that. But the thing is, as bad as that was, that's 2,100 Muslim lives gone. Mostly Muslim. Some Christian Arabs, I'm sure were involved, because there are Christian Arabs, all over Palestine. They're a minority, but they're still there. But that's 2,100 Palestinians killed. Okay, ISIS has killed so many more Muslims in Iraq and Syria recently, and Assad has killed so many more Muslims. All right, and yet there weren't any major, massive protests against them. There was a pro-Hamas rally during the fighting and a massive protest in Amman against Israel. For a regime, the Israeli Netanyahu government, in this instance, killed about 2,000, okay? A little over 2,000, 2,100 Palestinians, which is awful. Some of them were militants who should have been killed, but most of them were not. But that pales into the, compared to the tens of thousands of people that ISIS has now killed, and the hundreds of thousands that have died in the civil war in Syria. But where are the protests against that? So there is a bit of a problem within Islam right now of being able to honestly look at itself and criticize itself. And I'm glad that Bill Maher is out there talking about that, but then he takes it too far. Because especially Harris, but also Maher, are basically saying Islam inherently has these problems, and it's painting Muslims and Islam with that brush. And Christoph's response is to say that this is not mainstream belief in general, and certainly not all over the Muslim world. And he says, quote, "But this is such a caricature of Indonesia, of Malaysia, of so much of the world. And this does have a tinge, a little bit, of how white racists talk about African Americans and define blacks by characteristics, he means, which are not representative," end quote. That's very important, all right? The way you talk about this and the way you characterize really does make a difference. You have to call Islamic extremists out for what they are. You have to call people who harbor extremist views out for who they are, but you can't alienate and paint the moderates that you need as your allies against these people to at least work on and pressure and convince the nonviolent ones to stand up against the violence, even if they share those beliefs. So that all Muslims, other than the terrorist freaks, are loud and clear. There's no room for violence like this. And that's really what needs to happen. And let's talk about, these four guys now individually. Briefly, Christoph, I am totally with on this. He is very nuanced with these columns. He, at one point earlier last year, he wrote a column talking about, as much as we have to be aware of Islamophobia and stand up to that, we also have to realize that Islam does have a problem. That tolerance for other beliefs is not very strong in large parts of the Muslim world right now, and this type of stuff isn't happening in the same way in other societies, non-Muslim societies, and we really have to confront this without being bigoted or oversimplifying or painting all Muslims as intolerant, or most of them. So at the same time, he could write a column saying we do need to question what's going on in Islam and challenge the higher occurrence of intolerance within Muslim governments and Muslim societies. But we also need to realize there's a lot of diversity in Islam and be careful about how we speak about it, and speak about it more in terms of more localized regions and countries rather than as a faith in general, and stick to the story that is the real problem, which is fundamentalist extremist religion. Okay? And then I'm going to go a step further, actually, personally, and say that it's religion in general, but we'll get to that. All right, so that's Christoph, and I'm with him. All right, Fareed Zakaria issued a very similar viewpoint. Then we've got Ben Affleck, who's basically right, and the huge point that he made, actually, which I forgot to mention, is that the West has killed far more Muslims in recent years, our invasion of Iraq, Afghanistan, other stuff, than Muslims have killed Christians. So whether it's Europeans or Americans, our armies have been rampaging, maybe with good intention, but it doesn't matter. All these people have died as a result of our actions, either directly from our bullets and bombs or because of the conditions we allowed while we were in charge, and it was our responsibility to not allow them. That's a lot more people that died because of what we did than Westerners that have been killed by terrorist Muslims. So here's the thing, okay? If we're going to say that these extremists are a reflection on Islam in general, we also have to look at what our Christian Western societies, which are certainly more secular, but they're still mainly Christian in some ways, we have to also say, well, then the fact that we would let something like the Iraq War happen is a reflection on Christianity and Western values. And that's right. He's totally right on that. However, there is another distinction that needs to be made, and that is that our invasion of Iraq or Afghanistan, Libya, wherever, Libya actually made a lot of sense, but we're going to stay away from that right now. But Iraq and Afghanistan were not launched for religious reasons. There was not primarily religious ideology or religious drive. It was different reasons. We were Christian societies, but we were acting for non-Christian reasons overall to do this. These extremist groups, their main reason, many of them, especially ISIS and Boko Haram, their main articulation of why they're doing what they're doing and their ideology and their motive is religious in nature. So that is different. Islam is more closely tied to these killings by the terrorist groups than Christianity is tied to our killings from Iraq, but it's still a reflection on our society and religion in our society that we allow something like that to happen. Okay? So anyway, those are important points to be made. But Affleck's right about everything except he is wrong in trying to equate the level of extremism and to not see that there is a bigger problem in Islam right now. But his other points are spot on. We're talking about 1 billion plus people. We can't make wide generalizations, and that the West has killed more people, and that we should make sure we understand that reflects on us in our culture / religion or whatever. Okay? Then let's get to Bill Maher, who, like I said, I basically agree with his main points, but he just takes them too far. He's talking too much about Islam and not about Islamic extremists. And it's not inherent within Islam. It's in relation to other religions. And he admits and he knows that in the past it's been different, that Muslims are more tolerant than Christians for a long time. But it's not Islam, the religion, as the main problem. Because he's also pretty anti-religious, but really is he doesn't understand enough that there are other religious extremist things going on right now. In this most recent episode, he sounded like he was a little bit more um, admitting of that. But still, I mean, you have the Lord's Resistance Army, which is a Christian terrorist group, and you have um, it's killed thousands of people, driven millions from their homes. You had the Serbs massacring Muslims by the thousands in Orthodox Christian Serbs in the Balkans in the 90s, and they were committing ethnic cleansing in Kosovo. And you have Buddhist monks killing a lot of Muslims in Burma. You have the Buddhist establishment in Sri Lanka has been very awful to the Tamils, and the Tamil Tiger Hindus have been using suicide bombs and terrorism against Buddhists there. And Hindus in India can be very extreme to Muslims. I mean, it's and violent. There was a pogrom that the current president, the new president of India, Modi, is implicated in back in the day. So we can't speak as if these things aren't a problem, and we should not speak as if we can talk about Islam being violent, because it's not Islam. It's a small segment of Islam. And yes, too many Muslims do hold those beliefs, but we still, that the activity is okay and don't act on it, but we still can't talk about the whole religion or the religion in general as being like that. And do it in a way that singles it out compared to other religions. We can't talk about religion and violent being terrible. We can't talk about Islam being violent compared to other religions in a general sense. We can talk about Islam being violent today in a very specific short-term time period, the here and now, but we must recognize that that has not been the case in the past. And then, so there's where I differ with Marr, who I usually agree with. And then with Harris, it's the same, but then there's other levels where he's so anti-religion that he will look at a situation where Israel was fighting Gaza or Hamas, and Hamas is a religious extremist group, so pretty much everything Israel did was fine in that conflict this summer. Just he's so hard on the religious ones that he's just gonna basically give Israel a free pass for how they deal with Gaza in this particular situation. And to me, that's way, way, way too far. And he wrote a whole thing about how we're criticizing Israel too much during the Gaza thing. I disagree with him completely. The dimensions of that conflict, furthermore, not mainly religious. It's mainly about power, control, land, sharing resources. And he was on, Harris was on the Young Turks, and the main guy interviewing him there, he, hates religion as well as Harris, but he had issues with and likes Harris on a lot of issues, but he had problems with how Harris was talking about Islam in comparison to other faiths, and how, for me and for this guy, Harris was really making excuses for other faiths and the inherent potential, or sorry, the inherent potential in these other faiths for abuse and violence. He started talking about Christianity and Judaism, for example. So after the show, Sam Harris ends up being a guest on the Young Turks, and the head of that online news show, who's very outspoken in his not being cool with religion, and shares that with Sam Harris. And he comes off, he starts off saying that he admires a lot of Sam Harris's work on that subject, but he too, like Christoph and Affleck, was offended, and felt Sam Harris needed to be taken down a peg as far as how he was talking about Islam in this particular situation, as he discussed it on Bill Maher's show. And it's a really good back and forth. It's pretty long. It's well over an hour. I think it's over 2 hours, actually. But because there are points of agreement among them. But I think the host is actually really good in pointing out how Harris's view of Islam is quite narrow, as is his view of other faiths, in that he keeps talking about the Quran. And let's just give him the benefit of the doubt for the sake of the argument here, that he's right in this point he's making. And I'm going to say he's not, but in order to illustrate a point, he says that the Quran encourages more violence within its text, and that if you read, for example, Christianity today doesn't really focus on the Old Testament as much, and Judaism today doesn't do that either in the way Judaism is practiced. He says, isn't violent like that anymore. And to a degree, there's some truth to that, okay? And he says, because the Quran encourages more violence than these other holy texts, we really can't say Islam is inherently worse and is more of a problem. And for me, what I say to that is, it's not just about the text, it's very much also about the practice. And if you have centuries and millennia of faith with a text that says, don't kill people, but they kill people anyway, you can't judge the faith by, well, the text says not to. You have to look at the practice overall, how those texts are used and misused. And we could argue, even when some say they're being misused, maybe they actually are being properly understood. Some of these passages that do call for killing and rape and slavery, those aren't being misunderstood by the people practicing them. They're pretty clear, actually. So that's a whole other can of worms. But anyway, so even if we take Sam Harris at face value in terms of his focus on the Quran, we have to raise the issue of practice. And there's a lot of history of practice, Jewish practice, Christian practice, Buddhist practice, Muslim practice. And some of these faiths have gotten a lot less violent only very recently. And by very recently, I mean anywhere from the last 200 years, but really even mainly the last 100 and even the last few decades. And some are becoming more violent. You can argue that Judaism in Israel today is becoming more violent. That's certainly not the case in the US or Europe, but in Israel, there's a militancy among many rabbis and more conservative religious people, both in the army and in the settlement movement. That's something to consider. But anyway, so Harris is so fixated on the Quran and what it can encourage people to do. And he makes this point about, well, this is the Quran and it's different than the way other texts are used today. But he still is missing the point of practice, because practice isn't just about the texts. And there's a huge tradition in Christianity of anti-Semitism that only in the last few decades has really been officially purged, at least in the Catholic sense. We can't speak about all Protestant churches, okay? But we can certainly say that the Catholic Church has moved past that in an official sense. That doesn't mean all Catholics have. But there's a lot to religious practice that go beyond the books. And there's a lot of negatives to be looked at as far as Christian practice in particular that go beyond the Bible. And often people will use the Bible as justification sometimes, but many times they don't need to, and it's beyond what's in the Bible. But that still is big picture how you're going to have to look at any religion and judge it. It's not just what's written down on paper, it's what people do and what they have done over time consistently. So Sam Harris's narrow focus on what is wrong with Islam misses how practice can often transcend texts, but are just as important a part of a religion as these texts. The text isn't simply the correct way and the pure way, and then you discount practice and say, oh, well, they misunderstand. It's all one and the same. It's a set of beliefs and practices, okay? So he misses that. He's just way too narrow on that, and if you factor practice into it, it's extremely hard to make the case that Islam is somehow, in general and over time, more violent and more dangerous. And then going back to where I said, let's, for the sake of argument, give him this point. I'm not going to give him this point because, as I mentioned earlier, white Southerners were using the Bible to justify slavery. The Lord's Resistance Army, a Christian terrorist movement in Africa, is using the Old Testament to justify horrific things, but they're correctly interpreting the text. These texts call for stoning of people for this offense and beating of people for that offense and executing people for this offense. That's all in there. You can all look it up. It's all in those holy books, okay? So I don't agree with him either that the Quran is somehow inherently more violent and able to be more used for justification. Because Christians, apologists, will all too often say, well, the New Testament is different than the Old Testament, but that doesn't matter because the Old Testament is still part of Christian scripture and Christians still use it to justify violence. And there are still, though not as many, passages in the New Testament that can justify a whole lot of awful things as well. So, and I think the host of Young Turks does a good job of really pressing Harris on this to say you really can't offer a free pass. And when you talk about, America invading Iraq and Western Christian countries doing lots of awful violence, whether it's with bombs or planes or whatever, yes, there's not as much of an explicit religious tie as I mentioned, but you cannot separate that from society. You can't only say terrorists talking about Islam are a bad reflection of Islam, but that, as I mentioned before, violence perpetuated by Western societies is not a reflection on the religious values that infuse those societies. The link may be less direct, but again, this is where I think Harris is really off. So, all right, we've gone through those four guys from that panel on Bill Maher's show. And now we need to talk just a little bit about religion in general, history in general, and we need to understand that, particularly when we're talking about Islam and Christianity, but really any religion actually. But we have these two historical figures where we have a lot of information about them, or supposed to be reportedly, allegedly about them. And we have Muhammad with Islam and Jesus with Christianity. And for me, they're both overall great people that have a lot of good ideas that were valuable to human history. Not necessarily unique to them, but still valuable in their time and place. They had a unique message. But neither was perfect. And I hope I'm not offending anybody. I'm not trying to, but for me, they were both people, as Hitchens wrote in his article that I quoted, that I read from earlier. Muhammad was another mammal. Like, we're all mammals. Jesus is a mammal. Some people believe he was the son of God. I think he was just a great guy with some great ideas. But nobody's perfect. And you will find all types of quotes within the Bible and within the Quran that show each of them to be quite contradictory. And we really have to question, who are these sources? How do we know this? Who wrote them down and when? And usually, actually, in all these situations, within the Quran and the Bible anyway, all of the sources came decades or later, after these individuals, Jesus and Muhammad, had died. So that raises a red flag, because is this really what they said? And we know in both traditions that there were alternative versions that were destroyed. We have a few of those alternative versions around in terms of Gnostic Gospels and other quote-unquote lost Gospels from the Christian tradition, but most of those were burned, and we'll never know. And the same thing with Islam, the alternative texts. Hitchens points out that the specific wording of Quranic verses on the Dome of the Rock is not the same as the verses you will now see today in the Quran. So that is an interesting piece of evidence right there. But anyway, you'll find examples. This is outside the Quran. This is from a document he was supposed to have put out in the late early 7th century, when the Muslims had taken over a monastery, and Muhammad issued a document saying, be respectful of the nuns, let them worship, don't force any of them to marry you unless they're willing to. We're here to be respectful. But then there's other times where Muhammad calls for blood, and there's still other times where he, appears to have a fondness for very young women. I mean, this is a human being who's not perfect, but overall, I'm a fan. Same thing with Jesus, I'm a fan. He had, obviously, for you Christians, there's a lot of positive messages, and you'll hear that in church quite often. But, here's just one example. This is Matthew chapter 10, verse 34, to start, where Jesus is saying, quote, "Do not think that I have come to bring peace upon the earth. I have come to bring not peace, but the sword. For I have come to set a man, quote, against his father, a daughter against her mother, and a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. And one's enemies will be those of his household," end quote. And then quote again, because Jesus was quoting something. I'm not going to look into that right now. But the point is, that's not, let's all hold hands and love each other. He's talking about, I'm bringing conflict. So that's contradicting many of his other messages. So the point is, and we'll get to this later, religion allows for all types of interpretations because there is no consistency in any of these texts, really, in any of these traditions. You can find the horrid and the awful, right? You can talk about Muhammad saying there should be no compulsion in religion, and you can talk about verses where they're discussing how they can use their spoils of war, their sex slaves and money and loot and whatnot. So it's, you can find passages talking about what you should do when you conquer and who you should kill, and how you can have your rights, your way with certain women, but only under certain conditions. I mean, that's within the Christian tradition as well, okay, and the Jewish tradition. So that's one thing to keep in mind. The wide variety of behaviors depicted in these books, some good, some bad, and we'll get to that in my conclusion. But we also need to look a little bit at history here. And since we're talking about Islam, we need to talk about colonialism and European invasions, because in almost every country, in fact, I think every country that Islam was majorly practiced, Europeans came and took over, mainly over the course of the 19th and early 20th centuries. And these people were oppressed, they were abused, they were murdered, they were tortured for many, many years, kept down, treated as lesser objects, a means to an end. And that lasted a very long time. And this wasn't the only reason that this happened. There were other things going on in Islamic societies. But conservative, fanatical, radical, militant Islam, in large part, again, not only because of, but in large part because of this Western assault on their way of life, on their polities, on their societies, this type of Islam really grew and spread in that context of Muslims having an identity crisis, coming under attack, coming under invasion, occupation, all this stuff. And we know from all human history that when this type of stuff happens, people do tend to turn to their faith, and they do tend to become more extreme, especially if the people coming in are from a different culture and a different faith. If you look at the Jewish zealots, Sicarii, and others under Roman occupation, the Sicarii were terrorists. They were running around killing random people, civilians, just because they may have associated with Roman ways or dressed Roman or whatever. And they were random attacks, very terroristic in many ways. And then the zealots were, fanatical, and they didn't like being under Roman occupation. They were a foreign power, foreign religion, and they turned inward to Judaism. They became more radical, and you can find examples of this, with Irish Catholics in Ireland resisting the British, and you can find it all over the world in all different cultures. Okay, so that's not anything unique to Islam, but these types of invasions and this phase of colonialism and imperialism happened very recently. And then you had these secular kings and dictators in the post-colonial era, and in many ways the West, especially the European powers, are very responsible. or for how things turned out when they left, when they withdrew. It was often according to their design. But these people were also very repressive. And something else that's important to understand is that whether we're talking about the Arab caliphates or the Ottoman Empire, since we're focusing on the Middle East in many ways, there was not civil society developing at this time the way it was in the West. There's a long history in the Middle East, in the Arab world, of the only real public meeting place, the only real area where people can get together and discuss things publicly and organize for resistance or political protest was the mosque. So, especially in the post-colonial era with these secular dictators and kings, the mosque is civil society, and that becomes very problematic in terms of what we're talking about today, because there are not many frames other than through Islam that Arabs and Muslims have been able to really look at these situations on a larger scale. Pan-Arabism was a secular attempt to create an alternative to Islam, and it failed. It did not work. And in the wake of its failure, in the wake of the failure of the 1973 war and the peace treaty of Egypt, the towering power of the Arab world with Israel, Muslim Brotherhood really made a comeback. Islam became much more of a focus. Women started wearing hijab, veils, when they had not been, voluntarily, by the way, in places like Turkey now, and Egypt, which had very strong secular culture before, but now it's very different. So it's important to understand that when we're talking about radical Islam, in some ways we're talking about blowback from colonialism and imperialism. And I can just see some conservatives rolling their eyes at this, but it's true. There are consequences to things like centuries of occupation, decades of military oppression, invasion after invasion after invasion. And we're seeing some of that. And that's happening in places like Europe. It's not surprising at all, because that's the real origin of the imperialism that really destroyed Arab and Muslim society in so many places in the world. And the attempt to piece these societies back together and move forward hasn't been pretty. And the Arab Spring has not been pretty. And there's a real beast that's been unleashed. And much of it, again, was in reaction to either Western action or Western imposed tyrants. So, is it any surprise that the Shah of Iran and our support for them preceded the radical regime of Khomeini, Ayatollah Khomeini? No, to me it's not at all. Not surprising at all. So we need to recognize that. And we also need to recognize that there's a long, long history and a long tradition in Islam that far exceeds in length, consistency, and duration the recent horrors we're seeing right now of violence and intolerance and bloodshed. But there's a long history within Islam relative to Christianity, relative to Judaism when it was in control of its own destiny before the Greeks, Babylonians, Romans, and others took over that part of the world, relative to faiths in the East of tolerance and cooperation and respect. That's not to say full equality, okay? That just wasn't the world we were living in hundreds and hundreds of years ago, 1,000 years ago, but there really was a relative to other religions golden age of tolerance and coexistence in the Muslim world under the Caliphs, under the Ottomans. That wasn't 100% the case all the time. There certainly were exceptions, okay? Particularly very early in Islam, there were some issues with the Jews and Muslims, certain tribes, and that's in the Quran. But afterwards, it was different. And for most of Muslim history, it was different. Okay, you can read about this in some great books. I'm just going to list a few here. One's called A Vanished World, Muslim Christians and Jews in Medieval Spain. The author is Chris Lowney, Lowney. Another is called The Ornaments of the World, How Muslims, Jews, and Christians Created a Culture of Tolerance in Medieval Spain. Maria Rosa Menocal is the author there, Menocal. And another one I'll mention is Peace Be Upon You, 14 Centuries of Muslim, Christian, and Jewish Conflict and Cooperation. Zachary Karabel, Karabell. So there is a lot of positive things in Muslim history. Unfortunately, if we want to look at Christian history, for most of its 2,000 years, really only the last few decades are we able to say there's any kind of true spirit of tolerance for other faiths, respect for other faiths, and coexistence. Because before that, Christians were generally murdering and massacring anyone who wasn't agreeing with them if they came under control of other places. They were persecuting Jews. Anti-Semitism is something that was not necessarily explicitly called for in the Bible, but it certainly became a huge part of Christian practice and tradition, and lasted for. It still happens. It still exists today. It's obviously not as strong as it was before. That culminated in the Holocaust, 6 million people murdered in ovens and concentration camps. You can't say Islam has done anything like that ever in its history. Okay? But even before Hitler and concentration camps, you can go all through Christian history and there's horrible treatment of Jews. And Muslims, right? When Ferdinand and Isabella took over Spain, they basically said you can leave, convert, or we'll kill you. That was to the Jews and the Muslims. And when the Crusaders took over Jerusalem, they massacred every Muslim and Jew in the city. When the Muslims finally took it back, about a century or so later, Salah ad-Din, one of the great men in history, declined to respond in kind. And some were sold in slavery, but most of the city's inhabitants were allowed to live freely and stay there unmolested or get free passage out, and were allowed to worship in Jerusalem. So that's just the truth. Okay? That's something important to recognize. And so I want to jump back to the 21st century now. And a few years ago, there was this project called the Cordoba Center, referring to one of the great cities in medieval Spain that Muslims, Christians, and Jews coexisted in, and a lot of great cooperation and scholarship happened under Muslim rule, because this was the so-called Ground Zero Mosque that a lot of conservatives were freaking out about. And New York Mayor Michael Bloomberg, who was mayor at the time, came out strongly in support of Muslims being allowed to establish this center near Ground Zero, that there's nothing wrong with it. And he gave one of the best speeches I've heard in a long time about politics and religion and everything. And I encourage you all to take a look at it. But what I'm going to read from is the speech of a priest who was at this big press conference that Bloomberg had, where he came out in 2010 very much in support of the establishment of this Islamic center, the quote-unquote Ground Zero Mosque. So I'm going to read that now. This is a priest, a Catholic priest. My name is Father Brian Jordan. I was a chaplain at Ground Zero from September 12th, 2001 till the end of June 2004. I lost my mentor and good friend, Father Michael Judge, and 10 other wonderful friends from childhood, college, and I'm still grieving. However, this I want to say. All my sisters and brothers in the same God throughout the world, New York, Islam did not bring down those towers. It was fanaticism. It was abuse of free will. Do not blame Islam. Do not blame the Muslim sisters and brothers. Blame the fanatics. There are fanatics in every religion, not just Islam. We're here to be brothers and sisters in the same God and realize the importance of God's love. End quote. You know, I think he really hit it on the head. This really is not about Islam. It's about fanaticism, which is exactly what Christoph said on Bill Maher's show and what he's written about. And that's very important to understand. At the same time, with respect to Maher and Harris and others, Islam does have more of a problem right now. In this blink of an eye, when we do call it out, it's important that we do acknowledge that our own faiths are not perfect, or our non-faiths, where atheism sometimes has caused issues as well. But our own faiths are not free from guilt in these areas, and we need to be careful how we talk to Muslims and how we phrase things. Because as both Fareed Zakaria and Nick Christoph mentioned, if you're just saying bad things about Islam, that's it. That's your message. It's bad. That's not going to win hearts and minds. And this goes to the question of moderate Muslims and standing up. And many of them do. But as we did mention, there are a significant number who aren't violent at all, but who do share either most, all, or even just some of the really bad belief systems that the extremists who are violent share. That apostates should be executed, that honor killing is okay, those type of things. And we need everybody, including those people who share those beliefs, but are against and don't carry out the violence. We need them all to unite and be very loud in this. We need the rally that was the size of the Hamas rally against the Israeli attack on Gaza. We need that rally size against ISIS and the Paris attack in Muslim cities and countries all over the world. We really do need to have everybody unite. And yes, there are plenty of Muslim moderates that the media is not covering and should cover more. Thank goodness they are covering them in France today. But we also do have to recognize that there are too many people that do give that violent action a space by not condemning it, by not making it completely clear. You act like this, you are cast out of our society. We have zero tolerance and zero acceptance. There are too many people that sympathize with what those people are doing, even if they aren't going to act on it and are not going to be violent. Or I could be having dinner with them and be completely safe. They would never threaten me with violence. But they do offer tacit support, or at least non-condemnation and non-vocal condemnation of the violent extremists. So that is something that we have to realize. Both that right here and now, Islam is confronting some problems to a degree that other religions aren't, even though other religions are confronting the same problems and are not free of them. But we also can't paint Islam in general as a violent extremist religion, because that's not true. And then we have to realize that it matters how we respond, how we in the West, how our societies respond to this threat. Because it is an attack on our way of life, it is a threat on our way of life, but it needs to be kept in proportion to the threat. It can't be dismissed, but we can't overinflate it. And I just want to point out that this certainly doesn't justify the attacks, but France has not been particularly warm to its Muslim immigrants. It has banned veils. It's banned religious public displays in general, in schools and other public areas. So if I'm a Christian, I can't wear a cross, but I'm not compelled to wear a cross in Christianity. Some Muslims, not all, some Muslims believe that Muslim women are compelled to wear a veil. And that's a very important part of their faith. For other Muslim women, they don't have to. It's just a choice, and they don't want to. And it doesn't bother them the same way. But they might be offended that France is telling the other women that they can't. And certainly the women that want to wear the veil, that choose to, that feel that's an obligation, are offended and feel like their religion is being interfered with. So those types of laws and restrictions are not going to bring about a better interaction between Muslims and non-Muslims and help Muslims integrate better into society while still retaining their own unique identity. It's going to provoke reaction. And the reaction cannot be violent, and it should not be violent, and you can never justify violence because of something like that. But That's something important to think about too. All right? If we are talking about freedom of religion and freedom of the press and how they're linked in really the same right, how to have one, you really have to have the other. France has to take a look at its system right now that does restrict the veil and hijab. If they want Muslims to respect freedom of speech, they should also be respecting freedom of religion a bit more. However, again, that doesn't justify anything that happened. And that's why Je suis Charlie, even though I don't like what those cartoons represented and the way they were done, I still am going to say Je suis Charlie because I stand up for free speech, and that was an assault on free speech, completely unacceptable. It was an assault on Jews for who they were when they attacked the kosher deli, totally unacceptable. And this is a situation not unique to Islam, but again, much more frequent and a stronger level right now in Islam. But that's the problem with religion, and this is my conclusion now, is that you can look at Socrates and apply his standards. And even if Socrates gets a little weird here and there, you can apply the standards that he lays out, and they're consistent. And they will show when Socrates is a little weird, then you can judge him by his own standards and his own methodology for how to behave and how to look at the world. You can look at Newton's laws of physics, Kant's philosophy, and do the same thing, where there's no way to interpret becoming a mass murderer or super intolerant or these other horrible things, slavery, that type of stuff. There's not really room for these horrible things. These guys, their philosophies are very consistent. Likewise, you take another piece of fiction. Notice I said another because I really feel like the Bible and Christianity in many ways, it's mythology and tradition, some history, but it's the mythology, origin stories for a particular tribe, a particular group of people. Nothing horribly special compared to any other origin story. It just happens to be, the origin story that was adopted by Christianity, and so it stayed less tribal and became more global because Christianity became global. But you look at Lord of the Rings, okay? You look at what Tolkien did with that world where there is a morality tale. And not all the characters are perfect all the time. Sometimes you wonder if Sam, the way he treated Gollum, pushed Gollum away from trying to redeem himself, and he was too hard on him, and maybe Sam was too hateful and too filled with anger, and that's certainly something that's confronted. And the characters deal with this and confront it. There are times where some of the other kings of men really are failing, and they resort to jealousy and bitterness, but they realize they make mistakes and they try to transcend them. And that's a consistent line. Aragorn is good. He's good from the beginning. He's good from the end. And when people make mistakes, they acknowledge it. You had Legolas and Gimli who hated each other because dwarves and elves didn't like each other, and they transcended that. There's no way to interpret, I should hate dwarves and elves because they're different. You can't read that in the Tolkien. It's just not there. Aragorn, when he wins the war at the end and becomes king, if you read in the appendices, he spares the orcs that survived, and he gives them their own place to live in, and they live in peace. Orc and man live in peace together, okay? If this is the Old Testament, Aragorn would have massacred them down to every woman and child, most likely, at the order of some divine being, right? Gandalf isn't angry, grumpy, and judgmental and killing people he doesn't like just because he doesn't like them and in a genocidal, massive way, and then becomes a nice guy. No, he's consistently good, compassionate, understanding throughout. Sometimes he has a temper here and there, but he's still the same Gandalf. There's not this schizophrenic God of the Old and New Testament, okay? Where you can't look at Tolkien, you can't look at Lord of the Rings and say, sometimes it's okay to kill because God clearly wants the hobbits and Aragorn and other people to kill all these people here. They weren't necessarily directed, but that's what God said, and they did something bad, and so they all deserve to die. That is the opposite of the message. Crucial to the message of Lord of the Rings is Gandalf telling Frodo, quote, Many that live deserve death, and some that die deserve life. Can you give it to them? Then do not be too eager to deal out death and judgment, for even the very wise cannot see all ends. End quote. And it's the whole thing with Gollum, because Gollum maybe has a role to play, and he deserves a chance. Even if they're not going to make good on that chance, that doesn't mean it's up to us to take it away from them. But in the Old Testament, someone sleeps with someone and someone else doesn't like it, they get to kill that person. I mean, it's just ridiculous. Rape, slavery, all this stuff. It's terrible. So what I'm saying is we take a great piece of literature like Lord of the Rings, or maybe Brothers Karamazov, or Anna Karenina, what have you, and they're very good morality tales. And there's a moral and ethical consistency in the best literature. And there's a consistency in science and philosophy and rationality, where if you apply the standards within those systems, within those books, those texts, those modes of thinking, they'll weed out their own flaws. You apply the overall morality within Lord of the Rings, and you can see when the heroes make mistakes, and they generally see it too. But that's not the case in religion. That's not the case in holy texts like the Bible and the Quran. It's been written down, so it must be good, and God said it, and whatever, and we can't question it because it's not fiction. It's real, every word. And that is the problem, because there is too much bad within these texts, within these traditions. There is a lot of good. There are some wonderful things in all religions. Some great lessons, some great examples for moral behavior, ethical behavior. But then there's horrid, horrible things as well. Genocide, murder, slavery, rape. All condoned by God, all encouraged by God, and given power and legitimacy. Even in the Ten Commandments, women are described in the same breath as cattle and property. Okay? So if we want that to be our values in the 21st century, there's something wrong. And that's the problem with religion. It will always have those hard things that are just plain wrong, because it comes from a different era in history. It comes from the infancy of our species and intellectual capacity. And so you have these really bad practices that survive in the text, and people can read the text and say, this is God's word, and God says it's okay, I'm going to do it. You can't have that in Lord of the Rings. You can't have that with Socrates or Kant or Newton. They're rational and ethically consistent ideas. And I'm going to end with another quote by Hitchens. This is on page 250 of God's Not Great. Quote, humanism has many crimes for which to apologize. By humanism, Hitchens is talking about secular humanism, rationality, non-religious approaches to ethics and morality, okay? Quote, humanism has many crimes for which to apologize, but it can apologize for them and also correct them in its own terms and without having to shake or challenge the basis of any unalterable system of belief. Totalitarian systems, whatever outward form they may take, are fundamentalists, and, as we would say now, quote, faith-based, end quote, and end quote for the whole quote there. So that's the thing. No matter how good most practitioners of most religions are, there is the ugliness, and some people are smart enough to ignore it and not to practice it and to turn a blind eye and still try to cling to their system. And if they do that, that's fine. I don't care. I'll support their right to do that. But there is the evil, ugliness, violence, whether in the text or in the tradition, that can be drawn from to justify things like we saw in Paris, to justify the Crusades, to justify the Inquisitions and witch trials, to justify kamikaze attacks and suicide bombers. That's as much a part of religion as any other part, and we need to understand that and realize there's always going to be that danger. But if we think for ourselves, if we follow philosophy and rationality, those systems protect us in a way that religion does not. So anyway, those are my thoughts. Je suis Charlie, je suis Ahmed. Let's all unite against this type of stuff, and let's not try to eliminate religion for goodness sakes, but let's recognize the inherent danger in all religions that have raised their ugly heads in every faith very strongly at different times in different places in history. Let's not single out Islam as somehow inherently worse, but let's be real and also admit that Islam right now, these past few decades, is having a problem to a degree that other faiths are not really having. And let's also recognize a lot of that's the product of the time and circumstances and legacy of colonialism and imperialism. But nevertheless, the people that really have to stand up to it and defeat it are not Christians, are not Buddhists or Hindus, they're fellow Muslims within Islam. And we saw a wonderful example of that in France after these attacks in Paris. Hopefully see that all over the Muslim world, so we can really divorce everyone from the violent extremists, even people who may agree with them, but don't act on the violence, so that violence is going to be